At dawn on a bitter winter morning in 1883, as ice drifted like broken glass along the East River, a frail woman in a black dress took the first deliberate steps across a bridge the world had sworn could never exist. Below her, the water churned with tides that had swallowed ships and men whole. Above her, cables of steel sang in the cold wind like a warning. Newspapers had called the bridge cursed. Preachers had called it an insult to God. Engineers had called it impossible. And yet, she worked. She was not an engineer by training. She carried no blueprints. What she carried instead was a basket of flowers, a lifetime of grief, and the weight of a promise made beside a deathbed. Her name was Emily Warren Roebling, and the bridge she was about to prove real, the Brooklyn Bridge, was the most dangerous, visionary, and human engineering miracle in American history. In the middle of the 19th century, New York City was not yet the polished global capital it would become. It was a city of mud and manure, of wooden tenements packed tight against one another, of horse-drawn carts rattling through narrow streets slick with sewage. Brooklyn, across the East River, was its own city entirely, growing fast but isolated, its residents dependent on ferries that were unreliable at best and deadly at worst. The East River was not truly a river at all, but a tidal strait, violent, unpredictable, and infamous. Sailors called it the gateway to hell. Ice floes crushed wooden hulls in winter. Fog swallowed vessels whole. Ferries capsized. Thousands died over the decades attempting to cross it. To suggest building a bridge across such water was considered madness. And yet, in 1852, a German immigrant engineer named John Augustus Roebling stood on the Brooklyn shoreline, stared into the chaos of the current, and saw something no one else could see. He saw a bridge. Roebling was not an ordinary engineer. Born in Prussia, trained in the rigid discipline of European engineering, he had immigrated to America with little more than his education and his stubborn belief that iron and steel could reshape the future. He had already proven himself by building suspension bridges across the Monongahela River and the Niagara Gorge, bridges that many had doubted, but that stood firm. But the East River was different. It was wider, deeper, more treacherous. The shipping traffic alone made the idea absurd. Any bridge would have to rise higher than any suspension bridge ever built, allowing tall masted ships to pass beneath. The towers would need to be taller than church spires. The cables would need to be stronger than any steel wire yet manufactured. Roebling proposed using steel wire instead of iron, a radical choice at the time. Steel was new, expensive, and largely untested at such scale. Most engineers distrusted it. Roebling did not. For years, he lobbied politicians, businessmen, and civic leaders. He published papers, he gave lectures, he endured ridicule. Newspapers mocked him openly. One editorial sneered that the bridge was a spider's web spun by a madman. But Roebling persisted. Finally, in 1867, after decades of argument, the New York State Legislature approved the project. The Brooklyn Bridge would be built. John Roebling was appointed chief engineer. He was 61 years old. He would never live to see the bridge rise. Only weeks after surveying the site, Roebling's foot was crushed between a ferry dock and a piling. The injury seemed minor at first. Then tetanus set in, locked jaw, fever, agony. As he lay dying, Roebling continued to dictate calculations from his bed, correcting errors, refining designs, fighting death with numbers and geometry. When he died in July 1869, the bridge lost its visionary. But it did not lose its future. That passed instead to his son. Washington Augustus Roebling was everything his father had trained him to be,
disciplined, brilliant, methodical. A former Civil War officer, he had survived the Battle of Gettysburg and the horrors of military engineering under fire. He understood pressure. He understood risk. At 32, he became chief engineer of the greatest construction project in the world. And almost immediately, the bridge began killing men. Among them, however, he would now bring a family of 3 engineers' work to bear. The ultimate challenge, however, would not be the danger of aft. It would be the mystery of what happened to men under pressure. The first challenge was the foundation. To support towers taller than any yet built, engineers would need to dig deep into the riverbed. The solution was the caisson, a massive wooden box sealed at the bottom, sunk into the river. Inside, workers would dig away mud and rock while compressed air kept water out. No one fully understood what compressed air did to the human body. Men entered the caissons daily, descending into a pressurized world of darkness and heat. The air was thick, heavy. Candles burned strangely. Voices sounded wrong. When shifts ended, workers rose too quickly to the surface. They screamed, they collapsed, they convulsed. The sickness became known as the bends. Nitrogen bubbles formed in their blood, attacking joints, nerves, brains. Some men were paralyzed, some were crippled for life, some died screaming in agony. Washington Roebling himself entered the caisson repeatedly to inspect the work. One day he stayed too long. When he emerged, he collapsed. He would never fully recover. The disease left him partially paralyzed, hypersensitive to light and sound, in constant pain. Eventually, he became confined to a room in his Brooklyn Heights home, unable to visit the construction site. The bridge lost its engineer. Once again, it should have died. It did not, because Washington Roebling was married to a woman who refused to let it. Emily Warren Roebling had not been trained as an engineer, but she was intelligent, disciplined, and fiercely loyal. As her husband lay incapacitated, she began studying his notes, then his textbooks, then advanced mathematics, strength of materials, cable construction. Slowly, she became his voice.
Every day, Washington observed the bridge through a telescope from his window. Every day, Emily carried his instructions to the site. She spoke to foremen. She argued with contractors. She relayed data back to her husband. She corrected mistakes. She became, in effect, the chief engineer. Many resented her. Some mocked her. Others tried to sideline her entirely, accusing Washington of incompetence and calling for his removal. Emily fought them all. Years passed. The towers rose from the river like stone cathedrals, massive Gothic arches that redefined the skyline. The cables were spun by hand, wire by wire, thousands of strands bound into living steel. Then, disaster struck again. A contractor secretly supplied inferior wire. Thousands of strands were already embedded before the fraud was discovered. Removing them would have required dismantling the bridge entirely. Washington recalculated. The bridge would still stand, he said, with enough margin of safety. It was overbuilt, immensely so. But doubt spread. Rumors claimed the bridge would collapse the moment it opened. Preachers warned congregations. Newspapers predicted mass death. When construction finally ended after 14 years, the public was terrified. On May 24, 1883, opening day arrived. President Chester A. Arthur attended. So did the mayor of New York. Cannon boomed, bands played, flags snapped in the wind. But the crowd hesitated. Then Emily Roebling stepped forward. Carrying a basket of flowers, she crossed the bridge slowly, deliberately, her footsteps echoing on the wooden planks. Others followed,
Thousands poured across. The bridge held. 6 days later, a false alarm caused a panic. 12 people were crushed to death in a stampede. Once again, fear surged. To prove the bridge's strength beyond doubt, P.T. Barnum marched 21 elephants across it, led by the famous Jumbo. The bridge did not move. The Brooklyn Bridge became more than steel and stone. It became a symbol of ambition, sacrifice, and the terrifying cost of progress. More than 24 workers had died building it. Many more were permanently injured. Families were broken. Lives were shortened. Yet the bridge stood. It stands still. Every cable carries the fingerprints of men long dead. Every stone bears the memory of hands that bled. Every span is haunted by the cost of daring to defy the impossible. John Roebling never walked across his bridge. Washington Roebling saw it only from a distance. But Emily Warren Roebling walked it first, not just as a crossing, but as a declaration that belief, persistence, and human will could bend steel, tame rivers, and stitch cities together. Today, millions cross the Brooklyn Bridge without thinking. They take photos, they jog, they watch the skyline glow at sunset. Few know that beneath their feet lies one of the most astonishing, dangerous, and human stories America has ever built. A bridge not just of stone and steel, but of sacrifice, obsession, and love. And it still holds. The bridge did not end its story when the last elephant stepped off its wooden planks. In many ways, that was only the beginning, because once the Brooklyn Bridge proved it could stand against gravity, wind, doubt, and fear, it began to do something far more powerful. It began to change America itself. In the years after its opening, New York transformed at a speed never seen before. Brooklyn, once a separate city, surged toward Manhattan not as a distant neighbor, but as an extension of it. Workers who once risked their lives on ferries now crossed the East River every morning on foot. Commerce exploded, neighborhoods expanded, the bridge stitched two worlds into one. And quietly, invisibly, it rewrote the future of engineering. Before the Brooklyn Bridge, suspension bridges were tentative things, fragile, conservative, bound by fear of collapse. After it, engineers dared to think bigger, taller, longer, stronger. The Brooklyn Bridge became the blueprint for modern infrastructure, its lessons embedded into every major bridge that followed. But behind that triumph lay unresolved ghosts. Washington Roebling lived another 40 years after the bridge opened, though much of that life was spent in pain. He never fully regained his health. Loud sounds still tormented him. Bright light still overwhelmed him. The bends had damaged his nervous system permanently. Yet his mind remained sharp. From his home overlooking the East River, he watched the bridge carry humanity across water every day. He wrote papers, he advised younger engineers, he defended the decisions he had made, especially the choice to leave the flawed wire in place. History would vindicate him. The bridge did not weaken, it grew stronger. As traffic increased, engineers marveled at how much margin Roebling had built into the structure. Trains eventually crossed it, then automobiles, then traffic loads far beyond what anyone in 1869 could have imagined. The bridge absorbed it all. Emily Roebling, meanwhile, became something America had never quite known how to categorize, a woman whose intellect and authority had quietly shaped one of the greatest engineering feats in history. She never held an official title. Her name was omitted from many technical reports. Some histories reduced her role to that of a devoted wife, but those who worked on the bridge knew better. She had stood toe-to-toe with men who doubted her competence. She had translated her husband's abstract calculations into physical reality. She had been the living conduit through which the bridge survived. In later years, Emily became an advocate for women's education. She traveled, she lectured, she studied law, she moved comfortably among intellectual circles that had once barred her entirely. When she died in 1903, newspapers finally acknowledged her role more honestly. One obituary called her the woman who carried the Brooklyn Bridge across the East River. Even then, the full weight of her contribution remained understated. The men who built the bridge, the anonymous laborers, were remembered least of all.
They were immigrants, Irish, German, Italian, men escaping famine, war, poverty. They worked 12-hour shifts in freezing winters and suffocating summers. They dangled hundreds of feet above the river on spinning wheels, trusting their lives to harnesses and luck. Some fell, some were crushed, some suffocated. Their names were rarely recorded, yet they built a monument that would outlive them by centuries. The Brooklyn Bridge entered American culture not as a structure, but as a symbol. It appeared in paintings, poems, songs. It became shorthand for ambition itself. Politicians invoked it, writers romanticized it, engineers revered it. And when America entered the 20th century, an era of steel cities and roaring machines, the bridge stood like a calm elder, reminding the nation that progress had once been earned inch by inch, life by life. Then came war. During World War I, the bridge was guarded against sabotage. During World War II, its lights were dimmed to avoid enemy aircraft. Troops marched across it, civilians fled across it. It became a silent witness to the rise of America as a global power. Through it all, the bridge endured. By the mid-20th century, however, its age began to show. Steel fatigued, stone weathered, traffic loads multiplied beyond original predictions. Some whispered that the bridge might finally fail. Engineers studied it obsessively. What they found astonished them. The bridge was not merely adequate, it was over-engineered to a degree almost unheard of today. John and Washington Roebling, guided by intuition and caution, had built safety margins that modern cost-conscious projects rarely allow. The bridge could still carry several times its intended load. Once again, the Roeblings were proven right. Restorations followed, decks were replaced, cables were inspected strand by strand. The bridge was not preserved as a museum piece, but as a living artery. And it kept working. In moments of crisis, it became something even more profound. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, as smoke rose from lower Manhattan and fear swept the city, thousands fled on foot. Subways shut down, roads clogged, panic spread. The Brooklyn Bridge filled with people walking silently away from disaster. Strangers helped one another. Some cried, some prayed, some simply walked, step after step, toward safety. Once again, the bridge carried the weight of human survival. It had done so before. It would do so again. Today, the Brooklyn Bridge is crossed by over 100,000 vehicles and pedestrians daily. Tourists photograph its cables without knowing how they were spun. Joggers pass memorial plaques without reading the names. Lovers lock their hopes to its railings, unaware of the sacrifices embedded in every rivet. And yet, the bridge speaks. It speaks of a time when America was young enough to believe that impossible things could be built, not cheaply, not easily, but with relentless dedication. It speaks of immigrants who gave their bodies for a future they might never enjoy.
It speaks of a woman who stepped into history when history refused to make room for her. It speaks of a father who dreamed beyond his lifetime, and a son who paid for that dream with his health. The Brooklyn Bridge is not just an object, it is an argument that vision matters, that persistence matters, that progress demands courage, and, sometimes, suffering. Long after the crowds thinned and the cannon smoke of opening day dissolved into memory, the Brooklyn Bridge entered a quieter, stranger phase of its existence, one where it stopped being merely a triumph of engineering and became something closer to a living thing. People began to speak of it as if it had moods. On foggy mornings, when the cables vanished into white nothingness and the tower seemed to float, newspapers described the bridge as brooding. During violent storms, when winds made the cables hum like enormous harp strings, residents swore the bridge was singing. At night, when gas lamps cast long shadows across its Gothic arches, it appeared ancient, older than the city itself. The bridge was not new, but it was never ordinary. Engineers from around the world came to study it. They climbed inside its anchorage chambers, vast underground caverns where cables disappeared into walls of stone the size of small fortresses. They measured vibrations, they analyzed stress, they marveled at calculations done without computers, without simulations, without anything but slide rules and human judgment. Again and again, the conclusion was the same. The bridge should not be standing. By modern standards, it violated rules, it broke conventions, it relied on intuition as much as math, and yet it worked. This unsettled people. Modern engineering increasingly favored efficiency, using exactly as much material as needed and not an ounce more. The Brooklyn Bridge, by contrast, was extravagant. It was conservative to the point of obsession. The Roeblings had built it not just to stand, but to survive ignorance, corruption, weather, and time itself. In doing so, they had accidentally future-proofed it. Yet the bridge was never immune to human folly. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, suicides began appearing in newspapers. Men and women stepped from the promenade into the river below. Some survived, many did not. The bridge became associated, quietly and uneasily, with despair as well as hope. City officials debated installing barriers. Engineers argued it would ruin the aesthetics. Others claimed it would weaken the structure. Nothing was done. The bridge continued to witness the extremes of human emotion: birthdays, weddings, protests, parades, funerals. It saw labor marches demanding fair wages. It saw suffragists demanding the vote. It saw immigrants arriving with nothing, crossing it towards dreams they barely dared to articulate.
It saw America change. By the 1920s, skyscrapers began piercing the skyline. Steel frames rose faster and taller than anyone had imagined. New bridges appeared: the Manhattan Bridge, the Williamsburg Bridge, cheaper, faster to build, less ornate. Some critics declared the Brooklyn Bridge obsolete. They were wrong. Unlike newer bridges, it possessed something intangible: dignity. When the Great Depression struck, the bridge carried the unemployed toward uncertain futures. Men leaned against its railings, staring into the water, wondering how a nation capable of such beauty could also permit such suffering. During World War II, soldiers paused mid-crossing, looking back at the skyline before shipping out. Some would never return. The bridge remembered them. It remembered everything. Time, however, is relentless, even with legends. By the 1960s and 1970s, New York City was crumbling financially.
Infrastructure decayed, crime rose, maintenance budgets were slashed. The Brooklyn Bridge suffered quietly, corroding cables, cracked masonry, weakened roadways. For the first time, real fear emerged that the bridge might fail not from engineering limits, but from neglect. A comprehensive inspection revealed uncomfortable truths. Some cable strands had deteriorated. Roadways needed replacement. The bridge required constant care to survive another century. Restoration began, slowly, expensively, contentiously. Purists argued every stone must remain original. Practical engineers argued safety mattered more than authenticity. Politicians argued about money. Through it all, the bridge waited. Piece by piece, it was renewed, not rebuilt, but healed. Modern materials were introduced discreetly. Old stone was cleaned and reinforced. Traffic patterns were altered. The pedestrian walkway, once an afterthought, became a central feature. As cities around the world raced forward, demolishing old structures for new ones, the Brooklyn Bridge became an act of resistance. It refused to be replaced. Then came the 21st century. The world grew smaller. Technology accelerated. Screens replaced paper. Attention spans shrank. And yet the bridge remained one of the most photographed structures on Earth. People from every nation walked its span, phones held high, chasing the perfect image. Few realized they were standing atop a story written in blood, nerve damage, grief, and quiet heroism. Few noticed the subtle curvature of the cables, the intentional redundancy, the way forces flow invisibly through steel and stone, like blood through veins. But the bridge noticed them. It always had. After September 11th, something changed permanently. The bridge was no longer just historic, it was sacred. It had been a path of escape, a lifeline when everything else failed. Survivors spoke of it with reverence. In memorials and documentaries, it appeared not as background scenery, but as participant, a witness. In the years that followed, new threats emerged: climate change, rising sea levels, stronger storms. Engineers once again turned to the bridge, studying how it responded to stress. Once again, it exceeded expectations. Wind tunnels confirmed what Roebling had intuitively understood. Flexibility was strength. The bridge moved, it breathed, it yielded just enough. It survived. John Roebling had once said that the bridge should be built as if it were to last forever. He had not been exaggerating. Today, the Brooklyn Bridge exists in two worlds simultaneously. It is a functional artery carrying the daily grind of modern life, and it is a relic, a reminder of a time when ambition was tempered by responsibility, when builders assumed they might be wrong and planned accordingly. It is admired by engineers not because it is perfect, but because it is human, because it contains mistakes that were corrected, risks that were calculated, and sacrifices that were borne by people who never knew if the structure would justify their suffering. Every cable strand represents a decision. Every stone arch represents a belief that the future was worth building, that cities could be connected, that impossibility was merely a challenge waiting for stubborn minds. The Brooklyn Bridge does not shout its importance. It does not need to. It stands, day after day, as proof that when human vision is paired with humility, discipline, and courage, even the most violent waters can be crossed, not once, but forever. Beneath the feet of millions, hidden behind locked doors and thick stone walls, the Brooklyn Bridge keeps its deepest secrets. Most people never see them. Deep inside the Manhattan anchorage, below street level, behind iron gates, lies a chamber so massive it feels more like a cathedral crypt than an engineering space. The air is cool and damp. The walls are built of limestone blocks weighing several tons each. Into those walls vanish the bridge's main cables, not tied, not bolted, but buried, swallowed by stone, and held by friction and gravity alone. There are no dramatic clamps, no visible endings. The cables simply disappear, as if the bridge has roots. This was one of John Roebling's most controversial decisions. Critics argued that cables should be anchored with visible mechanical fasteners. Roebling disagreed. He believed the safest anchor was mass itself, overwhelming, immovable weight. He designed anchorage blocks so heavy that even if the cables wanted to pull free, the earth itself would have to move first. In effect, he chained the bridge to the planet. Modern engineers studying these chambers have admitted something quite unsettling. Recreating this design today would likely be rejected. It's too expensive, too conservative, too inefficient. And yet, it works. This is the paradox of the Brooklyn Bridge. It was built at the edge of human knowledge by people who knew how much they didn't know. That humility, rare in any era, may be the bridge's greatest strength. Washington Roebling understood this better than anyone. Confined to his room, watching the bridge through a telescope, he had endless time to think about risk, about failure, about responsibility. He knew that if the bridge collapsed, it wouldn't be an abstract tragedy. It would be his name, his father's dream, his wife's devotion, and the lives of thousands crushed beneath the East River. So he erred on the side of excess.
Every calculation assumed error. Every load assumed ignorance. Every component assumed betrayal, by materials, by contractors, by time itself. When inferior wire was discovered in the cables, Washington did not panic. He recalculated. He added more strands. He absorbed the flaw rather than pretending it did not exist. This philosophy, designing for human failure, would later become a cornerstone of modern engineering safety. But in the 1870s, it was revolutionary. It was also deeply personal. Washington Roebling lived with constant pain, but he refused to relinquish control of the bridge. Critics accused him of clinging to authority he no longer deserved. Some city officials openly questioned whether a crippled engineer could be trusted with such a monumental structure. Emily Roebling shut them down. She documented everything, every instruction, every calculation, every decision. She learned how to speak the language of engineers fluently enough that no one could dismiss her as a messenger. When challenged, she responded with data. Slowly, resistance faded, not because society suddenly embraced women in engineering, but because the bridge kept rising. Success silenced doubt. Yet the human cost continued. Workers spinning cables high above the river developed vertigo, nerve damage, and psychological trauma. Some refused to climb again after watching friends fall. Others drank heavily to steady their nerves. There were no hard hats, no OSHA regulations. Safety was a rope, a prayer, and luck. When a worker died, the job continued. There were deadlines, contracts, money at stake. This is the uncomfortable truth behind America's great monuments. Progress was often paid for by those who could least afford to stop working. The Brooklyn Bridge was no exception. And yet, even in its cruelty, it created something rare, a shared sense of purpose. Workers spoke of the bridge as if it were a living challenge, daring them daily. To quit was to admit defeat. To continue was to become part of something that would outlast them. They were right. As decades turned into a century, the bridge developed a reputation for invincibility. Engineers ran stress tests. Mathematicians recalculated load limits using modern computers. Each time, the results came back stronger than expected. The bridge was absorbing traffic loads never imagined in the 19th century. It should have been exhausted. It was not.
Some began to joke half-seriously that the Brooklyn Bridge was immortal. But immortality does not mean invulnerability. In 1994, a shooter opened fire on a van traveling across the bridge, killing one and wounding others. The bridge had survived war, storms, and neglect, but now it faced modern violence. Once again, it endured. After the attack, security increased, surveillance was added. The bridge adapted, just as it always had. And then came the slow, relentless threat no one in the Roeblings' time could have predicted: time itself. Salt from winter de-icing seeped into stone. Steel expanded and contracted with rising temperatures. Traffic vibrations accumulated year after year. Climate change intensified storms and heat cycles. The bridge began aging in new ways. Engineers responded with continuous monitoring, sensors measuring movement smaller than a human hair. Digital models tracked stress in real time. The bridge became one of the most studied structures on Earth, and it kept passing the tests. What astonishes modern experts is not that the bridge still stands, but that it does so with grace. It flexes under load, it releases energy, it refuses to become brittle. It behaves less like a machine and more like a biological organism. This too traces back to Roebling. He understood something fundamental. Rigidity is not strength, adaptability is. That lesson echoes far beyond engineering. The Brooklyn Bridge has outlived empires of thought. It has watched industrial optimism give way to modern anxiety. It has seen America doubt itself, reinvent itself, fracture and repair. Through it all, the bridge has remained, unchanging in purpose, evolving in meaning. To some, it is a commute. To others, a photograph. To engineers, a masterclass. To historians, a human epic disguised as infrastructure. And to the city, it is a promise that even when ambition nearly kills its creators, even when doubt surrounds every step, even when the cost is unbearable, some things are worth building anyway, because they connect more than places. They connect generations. They connect sacrifice to meaning. They connect failure to endurance. The Brooklyn Bridge does not ask to be admired. It simply keeps standing. And as long as it does, it reminds America of something it once knew deeply: that the impossible is not defeated by speed or convenience, but by patience, humility, and almost stubborn faith in the future. Long after the engineers, historians, and tourists have had their say, the Brooklyn Bridge keeps one last unsettling secret. It was never meant just for its own time. John Roebling designed the bridge with a mindset that feels alien today. He did not ask, what is the minimum this structure must do to survive? He asked something far more dangerous and far more ambitious. What if we are wrong? What if our math is incomplete? What if our materials are weaker than we think? What if future generations load this bridge in ways we cannot imagine? So he built for ignorance. He built for error. He built for people not yet born. That is why the Brooklyn Bridge feels so different from modern structures. It was not optimized for efficiency or profit. It was optimized for survival. Every element, every cable, every stone, every anchor assumed failure was possible and planned for it. This philosophy is why many modern engineers quietly believe the Brooklyn Bridge may outlive much of what has been built since. Not because it is stronger in a simple sense, but because it was designed with humility. As the 21st century pushes forward, cities face uncomfortable truths. Infrastructure built quickly and cheaply now requires constant repair. Bridges collapse. Buildings fail inspections. Entire systems strain under loads they were never meant to bear. The Brooklyn Bridge watches all of this, without comment.
It has already endured worse. It survived before building codes, before safety standards, before advanced metallurgy, before computers, before modern medicine, before the idea that every risk could be calculated. It survived human uncertainty, and that may be the hardest force of all.